My name is Malene Brennan. If there's one thing people have always counted on me for, it's being the dependable one, the rock of the family. I've always been the one they turn to when things get tough, the one who answers the phone when someone needs help, and the one who steps in without hesitation, no matter the circumstances. This has been the story of my life for as long as I can remember. It might have something to do with how I grew up. Family was everything to us. We didn't have much, just enough to scrape by, to keep the lights on and food on the table. But we had each other. My parents worked tirelessly to make ends meet. My mom juggled 2 jobs, often coming home late, exhausted, but always with a smile. My dad worked long, grueling days in construction, his hands calloused and his body tired, but his spirit never seemed to waver. And then there was me, the youngest of 4 kids, always trying to keep the peace in a house that was as chaotic as it was full of love. It wasn't easy growing up in that kind of environment, but I learned early on that life wasn't about waiting for things to come to you. It was about stepping up when you're needed. Whether it's helping my brothers with their homework, listening to my sister's heartbreak over yet another boy who didn't deserve her, or just offering a shoulder to cry on when the weight of everything seemed too much to carry. I was the one they turned to, and I didn't mind. In fact, I found purpose in it. Being the person people depended on felt good. It made me feel needed, important. I liked being the one who could fix things, even when I couldn't fix everything. As I grew older, that sense of responsibility stayed with me. I went to college, determined to make a difference in the world, and eventually became a guidance counselor. Every day, I listened to the struggles of others, teens grappling with their futures, families torn by conflict, individuals lost in their own heads, and I did my best to help them navigate their paths. I thought I was doing something meaningful. I thought I had found my calling, that helping people was my purpose, the reason I was put on this earth. But life has a way of testing us, of throwing curveballs when we least expect them. Everything changed the day my sister Chloe lost her husband. Jet, her son, was just 12 years old, a little boy who suddenly had to grow up far too fast, forced to shoulder a weight no child should ever bear. Chloe, devastated and broken by the loss, did her best to hold it together, but it was clear she was struggling. She needed help. Jet needed help. And just like that, I found myself stepping in once again, not questioning it for a second. At first, it was the small things. Picking Jet up from soccer practice, making sure his homework got done, ensuring he had a clean uniform for school. But soon, those little acts of kindness grew into something more. I started showing up at every game, every parent-teacher conference, every school play. I became the one Jet turned to when he needed someone to listen, the one he trusted when he felt like the world was closing in around him. I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought I was helping him cope with his grief, that I was being the support he so desperately needed. But trust, I learned, is fragile. It takes years to build, but only a moment, a single wrong choice, to shatter it completely. At the time, I didn't see it. Maybe I didn't want to see it. The lines between love, support, and something else started to blur, and I was too deep in it to recognize the danger. This is the story of how I crossed boundaries I never should have crossed, how I broke a trust that was never meant to be broken, how I hurt someone I loved more than anything. It's not a story I'm proud to tell, but it's the truth. And if telling it helps even one person avoid the same mistakes I made, then maybe it'll be worth it. Jet loved his mom, Chloe, with everything he had. She was his world, his anchor in the storm. Chloe was the kind of mother who made every moment count. She was the one who cheered the loudest at his soccer games, staying up late to help him finish projects, and sitting by his side during thunderstorms, soothing him when the sound of rain pounding on the windows became too much to bear. Their bond was rare, unshakable, something many people only dream of. They had each other, and that was enough. But life, as it so often does, doesn't care about bonds. Chloe's life was taken suddenly and cruelly. She was on her way home late one night after working a double shift at the hospital. She was tired, so tired, her body worn from the long hours. She was just a few minutes from home when a drunk driver ran a red light and slammed into her car. In an instant, she was gone. Jet was just 12 years old. I'll never forget the phone call. It was nearly midnight, and the phone rang so loudly that it startled me awake. When I picked it up, it was Curtis Clark, a family friend who had been contacted by the police. His voice was trembling, barely audible, and all he could say was, "She didn't make it." In that moment, my heart sank. All I could think about was Jet. How would I tell him? How do you explain to a young boy that the person who was his entire world, the one person he could always count on, would never come home again? When I arrived at their house, Jet was sitting on the couch, his knees drawn up to his chest, staring blankly at the door as if he was waiting for her to walk through it. He didn't cry, not at first. He just sat there, silent and lost. I knelt down in front of him, and as gently as I could, I told him that his mom was gone. The moment the words left my mouth, it was like the light in his eyes went out. He didn't say a word. He simply collapsed into my arms, his body shaking with sobs so deep, so raw, that I feared he might break from the weight of it all. From that point on, I became everything to Jet. His father had long since abandoned him when he was just a toddler. Chloe had raised him alone, and now that she was gone, there was no one left. No one but me. And so, I stepped in. Someone had to. He needed me, and I wasn't going to let him down. At first, it was just the basics, ensuring he had food, clean clothes, and a safe place to sleep. But soon, the role I was playing became more complex. Jet was grieving in ways that I couldn't have anticipated, and the boy who once laughed easily, who once had dreams of his own, was now a shadow of that boy. He stopped talking to his friends, his grades started slipping, and the spark in his eyes dimmed. He became angry at the world, angry at the driver who had taken his mom, angry at her for leaving him just like his father had. And then, one night, about 6 months after Chloe's death, he finally broke his silence. I had been sitting beside him, helping with his math homework as usual, when, out of nowhere, he spoke, his words hanging in the air like an unspoken truth. "It's not fair," he said, his voice trembling slightly, as if the weight of what he was about to say had been building inside him for too long. "She was all I had." His voice cracked, and he looked at me, his eyes filled with unshed tears, vulnerable in a way I'd never seen him before. His face, so much like his mother's, twisted in pain. "Why did she have to leave? What did I do wrong?" The floodgates opened, and I felt my own heart shatter as the rawness of his grief hit me. I wanted so badly to tell him that none of it was his fault, that sometimes life was just cruel, that some things were beyond anyone's control. But as those thoughts swirled in my mind, I knew that words, no matter how comforting, wouldn't be enough. I couldn't fix his pain, and I couldn't replace what he had lost. But in that moment, I could offer him something that was even more essential: my presence. So, I did the only thing that felt right. I wrapped my arms around him, pulling him close as if somehow I could shield him from the agony of the world. "I'm here, Jet. You're not alone. I'm here," I whispered, the words more of a promise than a comfort. From that day forward, I did everything in my power to fill the hole that Chloe had left behind. I attended every soccer game, cheered the loudest, and helped him with every school project, always reminding him that he was loved, even though he'd lost so much. But as much as I tried, as much as I gave, I wasn't Chloe. I could never be her, no matter how much I wished I could. And maybe that's where the cracks began to form. The tiny fractures in a bond that, while founded on love, was growing increasingly complicated. Jet began to lean on me for everything. At first, it felt natural. I was the only one he trusted, the only one who truly understood him. He called me for everything. Small, trivial things like deciding what to wear for picture day, or more significant moments like asking for help with a tough assignment at school. Slowly, I realized he was skipping out on time with his friends, choosing to stay home with me instead. He told me once, his voice thick with a mixture of gratitude and sadness, "You're the only person I can talk to, Aunt Malene. You actually listen." Those words should have made me feel like I was doing something right, like I was giving him a sense of stability in a world that had been cruelly shaken, but not everyone saw it that way. Curtis, my cousin, and one of the few family members who still stayed in touch with me, began expressing his concerns. Over a quiet cup of coffee one afternoon, he hesitated before speaking as if choosing his words carefully. "You're doing an amazing job, Malene," he said, his voice cautious but sincere. "But Jet needs to learn how to stand on his own 2 feet. He's leaning on you for everything, and that's not healthy for either of you." At the time, I dismissed his advice. I told myself he didn't understand. He didn't see how much Jet needed me, how broken he was after losing Chloe. But as the weeks passed and I reflected on his words, I couldn't shake the uncomfortable truth they carried. I wasn't just helping Jet. I was holding on to him too tightly. In my desperate desire to be everything for him, I lost sight of something fundamental. He needed to grow, to learn to navigate the world without clinging to me as a crutch. And perhaps, in my need to fix everything, I blurred lines I should never have crossed. The cracks became more obvious as time went on. I saw them forming in Jet's ability to grow, in my judgment, and even in the bond we shared. While that bond was built on love, it was beginning to twist into something unrecognizable. Jet was changing. He was 15 now, and his voice had deepened. His shoulders had broadened, and the quiet, shy boy I'd spent years protecting was slowly morphing into someone I didn't fully recognize. It should have filled me with pride, and in some ways it did. But I couldn't help but feel terrified. He was growing up, pulling away from the little safe world we had built together, and I had no idea what that meant for me. At first, it was subtle. He started spending more time in his room, keeping the door closed when he used to leave it open. He laughed at my jokes less, shrugged off my offers to help with his homework, and preferred to bury his face in his phone rather than talk to me like he used to. I told myself it was normal. It was just a phase, something every teenager went through. But each time he pulled away, a small ache blossomed in my chest. He no longer sought my company the way he once had. It hurt more than I cared to admit. Then came Scarlett Larson. She was a classmate of his, bright, outgoing, and effortlessly charming in that way only a 15-year-old girl can be. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Jet seemed genuinely happy. Every conversation, no matter what we were talking about, seemed to come back to her. He couldn't stop mentioning her. How funny she was in class, how skilled she was at soccer. She was all he talked about, and every time her name came up, something in my stomach tightened. I should have been thrilled for him, but instead, I felt something I couldn't quite put into words. Loss. "I feel like I'm losing him," I confessed to Curtis one afternoon as we sat together sipping coffee. "He doesn't need me anymore." Curtis gave me a long, thoughtful look before responding, his voice full of quiet wisdom. "Malene, that's a good thing. Jet's growing up. He's supposed to need you less." I didn't say anything. I couldn't. Deep down, I couldn't imagine a version of my life where Jet didn't need me. I didn't know who I was without him. The first time it happened, I told myself it was an accident. Jet had stayed up late the night before working on a school project, and when I found him asleep on the couch, papers scattered around him in a chaotic mess, I didn't think much of it. I went to cover him with a blanket, just like I had done 1,000 times before. But this time I hesitated. His shirt had ridden up slightly, revealing the barest sliver of his lower back. My hand froze, hovering there for a moment too long. Something shifted inside me. A rush of guilt, of confusion, but also of something else I wasn't ready to confront. I ignored it, tucked the blanket around him, and went to bed, burying the feelings deep inside. But that moment marked the beginning of something more. Small, fleeting instances that felt harmless at the time, but added up to something bigger. A touch on his shoulder that lingered a beat too long, a compliment that felt a little too personal. I convinced myself it was all innocent, that I was just being affectionate, that nothing was wrong. But deep down, I knew better. I couldn't ignore the cracks that were forming, cracks that threatened to break everything I had worked so hard to build. The first time we crossed the line, it happened in the kitchen. Jet had just come home from soccer practice, sweaty and exhausted, yet grinning from ear to ear as he talked about how Scarlett had scored the winning goal. His excitement filled the room, but all I could focus on was the way he looked, the flush on his cheeks, the dampness of his hair, the way he smiled at me with such open trust. My heart raced, and before I could stop myself, I leaned in. The kiss was quick, barely more than a brush of my lips against his, but it was enough. He froze, his eyes wide in shock, and for a moment, everything stood still. I thought he changed into going to pull away, however he failed to. He moved step by step to me, along with his eyes almost piercing through mine. "What are we doing?" he requested, and earlier than I should utter a word, he held my waist and drew near him. I couldn't understand him at first. His gaze averted, his jaw clenched in silent turmoil. I had been struggling with these feelings for months, this constant confusion. Why did I feel this way? Why was I continuing to do things I knew deep down I didn't want to do? And then it hit me. I was afraid to disappoint him. But the truth was, I couldn't do it anymore. His words hung heavy in the room, a suffocating weight I could barely breathe through. I wanted to argue, to tell him that everything we'd done was mutual, consensual, that none of it had been forced. But deep down, a part of me knew he was right. I had crossed lines that should never have been crossed, and now I was standing in the middle of the wreckage, watching it all crumble. After he left, I sat there, motionless, for what seemed like hours. I replayed every word, every action, over and over in my mind. How had it all spiraled so far? How had I let it go on this long? How had I convinced myself that what we were doing was okay? The weight of it was unbearable, a crushing realization that I couldn't carry alone anymore. The next day, I reached out to Rebecca Pina, my best friend since college, the one person who never hesitated to tell me the brutal truth even when it was hard to hear. When I poured my heart out to her, she didn't sugarcoat a thing. "Malene," she said, her voice firm but not unkind. "You need to take a long, hard look at yourself. You can't fix this until you own up to all of it. Every last bit of it." Tears streamed down my face as I whispered, "I know. I just don't know how to make it right." "You can't fix it overnight," Rebecca replied. "But the first step is letting him go. Jet needs space to figure out who he is without you, and you need to figure out who you are without him." Her words hit me like a slap to the face, but she was right. In my attempts to protect him, I had distorted everything. I had turned him into someone he didn't want to be, someone he was never supposed to become. And for that, I hated myself. A few days later, Jet told me he needed space. He wasn't angry, but he needed time to think, to process everything. Hearing those words broke me. Yet, deep down, I knew they were necessary. As much as it hurt, I had no choice but to let him go. I spent the following days, restless and consumed by regret, replaying his words endlessly in my mind. "I don't even know how to tell you this," he had said, "but I felt like I couldn't say no to you for so long." Each time I thought about it, the weight of my actions became suffocating. For years, I had convinced myself that everything we shared was mutual, that I was helping him, loving him in the way he needed. But now, all I could see was how deeply I had hurt him. I wanted to fix things, to make everything right, but with each attempt to reach out, I froze. What could I possibly say that would erase the hurt I had caused? Every word I could think of felt inadequate, like trying to patch a broken dam with a piece of tape. Yet, I knew I couldn't leave things unresolved. At the very least, Jet deserved an apology. He deserved to hear me take responsibility. So, I wrote him a letter. Dear Jet, I don't even know where to start. How do I apologize for something that I can't even fully explain to myself? All I know is that I've hurt you in ways I never intended. And for that, I am deeply, profoundly sorry. When your mom passed away, I made a promise to myself. I would protect you, no matter what. I thought I was doing that, but somewhere along the way, I lost sight of what that truly meant. I crossed lines that should never have been crossed, and in doing so, I took away something I can never get back, your trust. You told me you felt like you couldn't say no to me, and that breaks me. Because the last thing I ever wanted was for you to feel trapped, to feel like you had no choice in anything. I can't undo what's happened, but I can promise you this. I will respect your boundaries. I will give you the space you need to figure out who you are without me. I'm not asking for forgiveness because I don't deserve it, but I hope, one day, you'll be able to look back and remember the good memories we shared, and know that, despite everything, I always loved you. I am so sorry, Jet, for everything. Love, Aunt Malene. I left the letter on his desk one morning while he was out with Bryson. I didn't expect an immediate response, not at all. But the waiting, that was unbearable. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart leapt into my throat, only to sink when I saw it wasn't from him. Days turned into weeks and still, nothing. I began to wonder if I had lost him for good. Then, one evening, there was a knock at the door. I opened it to find Jet standing there, looking older than his 19 years, holding the letter in his hand, its creases and folds telling the story of how many times he had read it. For a moment, neither of us knew what to say. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice quiet but steady. I nodded, stepping aside to let him in. We sat in the living room, the silence between us stretching, thick and uncomfortable, like a canyon. Finally, he spoke. "I've been thinking a lot," he said, his eyes focused on the letter in his hands. "About us. About everything. And I don't know if things will ever go back to how they were." His words stung, but I knew they were true. "I don't expect them to," I replied softly. "I just want you to know that I'm here no matter what you need, whether it's space, time, or nothing at all. I'll respect it." He looked up at me, and for the first time in what felt like forever, there was a glimpse of the boy I once knew in his eyes. "I'm willing to try," he said quietly, his voice carrying an uncertainty that matched mine. "But it's going to take time." "That's all I could ever ask for," I said, my voice cracking with emotion. We sat there not saying much, just sharing the space between us. A fragile, tentative kind of hope beginning to stir in the silence. It wasn't a resolution, not really. More like a fragile beginning. Uncertain, but real. I wish I could say that this is where the story ends, but the truth is, I don't know what happens next. I'm still trying to make sense of everything. I'm still trying to understand how I let it all get so out of hand and how to move forward from here. What I do know is that I've made mistakes, terrible ones, and I don't know if they can ever truly be undone. But I want to try. For Jet, for myself, for the chance to be better. So, now I turn to you. What do you do when you've broken someone you love? How do you make amends for something so unforgivable? I don't have all the answers, but maybe you do. If you've ever been in a situation like this, or even if you haven't, what would you do? How would you try to fix it? Please, share your thoughts. I'm here to learn, to listen, and to grow. And before you go, if this story resonated with you, or gave you something to think about, I'd love for you to like this post. It helps me know that you're here and that this story might reach others who need to hear it. If you think someone in your life could benefit from this conversation, please share this with them. And don't forget to subscribe. This isn't the end of my journey, and I want you to be part of it as we move forward, together. Thank you for being here. Your thoughts and insights mean more to me than you'll ever know.